Racist cop throws coffee at quiet black woman. He had no idea she was police commissioner. The fluorescent lights of Maple Street Diner cast harsh shadows across cracked vinyl booths where Officer Brad Mitchell sits in his usual corner. His uniform wrinkled from another night's shift patrolling neighborhoods he considers beneath his notice. His coffee growing cold as he scrolls through social media posts that reinforce prejudices that 20 years on the force have hardened into institutional racism disguised as law enforcement experience. At the counter, 53-year-old Dr. Angela Washington sits quietly reviewing budget reports that could reshape the city's approach to community policing. Her casual clothes and peaceful demeanor hiding the fact that she holds the highest law enforcement position in the state as police commissioner, whose reforms have made her enemies among officers who mistake brutality for strength, prejudice for wisdom, fear for respect, when leadership demands accountability that corrupt systems resist. Through informal networks that protect bad actors while punishing those who challenge methods that justice should eliminate, but that tradition defends through comfortable assumptions about who deserves protection and who deserves suspicion based on characteristics unrelated to actual behavior or threat assessment. Brad Mitchell's 20-year career in law enforcement reads like textbook example of how institutional racism perpetuates itself through officers who enter police work with prejudices that training either reinforces or fails to address, when cultural biases become operational guidelines that determine who gets viewed as threat versus citizen, who receives protection versus suspicion, who deserves respect versus contempt when power meets prejudice in combination that transforms public service into systematic oppression disguised as crime prevention through methods that create more problems than they solve while justifying themselves through statistics that circular reasoning produces when bias shapes both enforcement patterns and interpretation of results that confirm prejudices rather than challenging assumptions about crime, community, and a relationship between police and people they supposedly serve. His approach to policing reflects worldview shaped by media consumption that portrays black communities as inherently criminal rather than systematically disadvantaged. His understanding of social dynamics filtered through narratives that blame victims rather than examining systems that create conditions where desperation becomes survival strategy, when opportunities remain limited through discrimination that education can't always overcome, employment can't always provide, and law enforcement often exacerbates rather than addresses when officers mistake symptoms for causes, poverty for pathology, resistance for criminality, when people respond to treatment that denies their humanity while demanding their compliance with authority that serves some citizens while oppressing others through methods that justice should eliminate, but that institutional inertia maintains. The diner itself represents neutral territory where various elements of society intersect without necessarily connecting. Its 24-hour schedule accommodating shift workers, insomniacs, and people whose lives operate outside conventional schedules that prosperity creates for those whose circumstances allow predictable routines rather than survival strategies that adaptation demands, when stability becomes luxury that security provides, but that uncertainty threatens when employment, housing, and safety remain variables rather than constants in lives that institutional support might stabilize, but that systemic barriers often destabilize through policies that serve some populations while disadvantaging others in patterns that privilege maintains through comfortable distance from consequences that other people experience. Angela Washington's presence in the diner reflects her commitment to understanding community dynamics that policy decisions affect, but that administrative positions rarely require experiencing directly when leadership operates through statistics rather than street-level observation, through reports rather than personal engagement, through bureaucratic processes rather than human interaction that reveals how theoretical policies translate into practical realities that people navigate daily when institutional decisions create consequences that administrators might not anticipate if distance prevents awareness of impacts that proximity would reveal, if leadership chose engagement over isolation, when effectiveness demands understanding that experience provides rather than assumption suggest. Her career trajectory from patrol officer to police commissioner represents journey through law enforcement that few black women complete when systematic barriers create obstacles that competence must overcome while prejudice adds resistance that merit shouldn't require addressing, but that reality makes unavoidable when advancement depends not just on performance, but on navigating discrimination that informal networks maintain through cultural codes that protect insiders while excluding others. Regardless of qualifications that objective evaluation would recognize, but that subjective assessment often dismisses when bias influences judgment about who deserves opportunities that fairness should distribute based on capability rather than characteristics unrelated to professional competence or leadership potential that diverse perspectives could enhance if recognition replaced resistance. Tonight's encounter between Brad's entrenched prejudice and Angela's quiet authority will test every assumption about power, position, and the accountability that democracy demands from public servants whose authority derives from community consent rather than institutional privilege, whose legitimacy depends on service rather than dominance, whose effectiveness requires trust that respect must build, but that abuse inevitably destroys when officers forget that badges represent responsibility rather than superiority, protection rather than power, service rather than control, when law enforcement serves justice rather than just those whose comfort depends on maintaining systems that privilege protects through methods that democracy should eliminate, but that corruption often perpetuates through networks that accountability must penetrate if reform is to become reality rather than just rhetoric. The confrontation begins with seemingly innocent request as Angela asks waitress for directions to police headquarters where early morning meeting will determine budget allocations that could fund community programs or military equipment, depending on priorities that leadership establishes through decisions that affect thousands of lives, while remaining invisible to officers whose daily experience focuses on enforcement. Rather than policy, action rather than administration, immediate responses. Rather than long-term planning that shapes the environment where law enforcement operates through parameters that political decisions establish, but that cultural assumptions often override when prejudice influences interpretation of guidelines that objectivity should govern, but that bias frequently distorts. Brad overhears conversation and assumes Angela represents type of person he's been trained to view with suspicion. Black woman in working-class neighborhood asking questions about police operations, her presence triggering alerts that racial profiling has embedded in enforcement mindset that sees investigation rather than curiosity, threat rather than interest, criminal intent rather than civic engagement, when citizens seek information about institutions that serve them through processes that transparency should make accessible, but that defensive attitudes often protect through secrecy disguised as operational security when accountability threatens comfort zones that corruption requires for survival. Ma'am, you got business with the police? Brad interrupts, his tone carrying authority that uniform provides, but that respect must earn when law enforcement serves community rather than commanding it, when officers recognize citizens as employers rather than subjects. When power derives from consent rather than force, when democracy functions through accountability that prevents abuse, but that institutional culture often resists through informal networks that protect bad actors while punishing those who challenge methods that justice should eliminate, but that tradition defends through comfortable assumptions about whose rights matter when authority meets responsibility. Angela's response demonstrates patience that experience with institutional racism has taught her to maintain when confronting officers whose training apparently didn't include constitutional principles about citizen rights, community relations, or the professional courtesy that public service demands regardless of personal prejudices that individual officers might harbor, but that institutional policies should prevent from influencing official behavior when law enforcement serves everyone rather than just those whose appearance or circumstances match comfort zones that bias creates around assumptions about who deserves protection versus who deserves suspicion based on characteristics unrelated to actual behavior or threat assessment. I'm just asking for directions, officer, Angela replies calmly, her words carrying dignity that uniform should respect, but that prejudice often dismisses when authority becomes corrupted by assumptions about social hierarchy that democracy rejects through principles of equality that training should reinforce, but that culture often undermines when informal education teaches lessons that formal instruction contradicts, creating tension between official policies and actual practices that accountability must address if justice is to become reality rather than just aspiration that lip service acknowledges, while behavior contradicts through actions that reveal true priorities when pressure tests principles that comfort might maintain but that crisis often abandons. Brad's escalation reveals character that uniform cannot improve when personal prejudice overwhelms professional obligation. His response demonstrating how racism transforms law enforcement from community service into systematic oppression when officers mistake their personal biases for professional judgment, their cultural assumptions for operational guidelines, their prejudices for legitimate law enforcement concerns when authority becomes weapon rather than tool, when power serves ego rather than community, when badges represent superiority rather than service, when corruption replaces integrity as organizing principle for behavior that accountability should govern, but that institutional protection often enables through networks that defend misconduct while punishing those who report violations that honor should prevent, but that culture sometimes encourages. What happens next transforms minor interaction into career-defining moment as Brad's racism overwhelms whatever professional training he might have received about community relations, constitutional rights, or basic human decency that law enforcement requires when officers remember that uniforms represent service rather than superiority, protection rather than power, accountability rather than immunity, when authority derives from community consent that respect must maintain but that abuse inevitably destroys through actions that reveal character that badges cannot improve, when personal prejudice corrupts professional responsibility that oaths should guarantee but that culture might undermine. The coffee cup flies through air carrying more than hot liquid. It carries decades of institutional racism, centuries of systematic oppression, generations of abuse disguised as law enforcement, when officers forget that power serves people rather than dominating them, that authority requires accountability rather than just demanding compliance, that uniforms represent responsibility rather than privilege, when democracy functions through principles that training should teach, but that culture often contradicts, when informal education shapes behavior more powerfully than formal instruction, when peer pressure reinforces prejudices that policy should eliminate, but that practice often perpetuates through networks that protect corruption while punishing integrity. Angela's reaction to assault, physical and dignity attack that coffee represents, demonstrates composure that years of navigating institutional racism have developed when survival requires maintaining dignity despite treatment that would provoke justified anger in anyone whose humanity gets denied through actions that reveal how deeply prejudice penetrates systems designed to serve everyone, but that practice often reduces to protecting some while oppressing others, when bias influences who receives consideration versus who faces suspicion, who gets respected versus who gets dismissed, who deserves protection versus who becomes target, when law enforcement serves prejudice rather than justice through methods that accountability should eliminate. The other patrons in diner witness assault that transforms casual meal into moral test about whether bystanders will intervene when witnessing obvious injustice or remain silent, when speaking up requires courage that comfort zones discourage, when intervention demands risking comfort that inaction preserves, when accountability requires participation that detachment avoids, when witnessing wrongdoing creates choice between complicity and courage that character determines through decisions that define individuals and communities, when crisis reveals true priorities that normal circumstances might hide behind polite facades, that emergency strips away to expose authentic values that pressure tests, when comfort confronts conscience. Brad's justification for assault reveals mindset that transforms legitimate law enforcement into systematic abuse, when officers convince themselves that violence serves order rather than creating chaos, that intimidation builds respect rather than destroying trust, That fear promotes safety rather than undermining community cooperation that effective policing requires when law enforcement serves people rather than dominating them through methods that democracy rejects, but that authoritarianism embraces when power becomes end rather than means. When control replaces service as organizing principle for behavior that oaths should govern, but that culture might corrupt when institutional protection enables misconduct that accountability should prevent. People like you need to learn respect, Brad declares, his words revealing worldview that sees citizenship as conditional rather than constitutional, that treats rights as privileges to be earned rather than protections to be guaranteed, that views law enforcement as mechanism for maintaining social hierarchy rather than ensuring equal justice. When officers forget that democracy requires serving everyone rather than just those whose appearance or circumstances match comfort zones, that bias creates around assumptions about whose safety matters when authority meets responsibility through encounters that test whether power serves people or dominates them, when justice demands equality that prejudice resists through violence disguised as legitimate enforcement. The silence that follows Brad's assault stretches across Diner, like suspended sentence waiting for justice to arrive. Each witness processing implications of witnessing police officer attack citizen for no reason other than prejudice that uniform should never enable, but that culture often protects when institutional loyalty prevents accountability that democracy demand from public servants whose authority derives from community consent rather than personal prejudice, whose legitimacy depends on service rather than dominance, whose effectiveness requires trust that respect builds, but that abuse destroys through actions that reveal character that training cannot improve when corruption overwhelms integrity. Angela's response comes not through anger that assault justifies, but through authority that position provides when leadership demands accountability that individual officers might resist, but that institutional power must enforce if law enforcement is to serve justice rather than just protecting those whose prejudices align with cultural biases that systematic reform should eliminate, but that resistance often maintains through informal networks that defend misconduct while punishing those who challenge practices that honor should reject, but that tradition might defend through comfortable assumptions about whose rights matter when democracy faces authoritarianism. Officer Mitchell, Angela says, her voice carrying calm authority that experience provides when leadership confronts corruption, when accountability meets resistance, when justice demands response that effectiveness must deliver despite obstacles that institutional culture creates around misconduct that protection enables, but that exposure should eliminate through consequences that behavior earns rather than immunity that position might provide, when badges represent responsibility rather than privilege, service rather than superiority, accountability rather than protection, when authority serves people rather than dominating them through methods that democracy rejects. The use of his name creates moment of uncertainty as Brad processes how civilian knows his identity, when anonymity typically protects officers from consequences that accountability would require if transparency govern law enforcement operations rather than secrecy that corruption prefers, when misconduct remains hidden behind institutional loyalty that prevents exposure, when abuse gets protected through networks that defend bad actors while punishing those who report violations that honor should prevent, but that culture sometimes encourages when prejudice overwhelms professionalism that oaths require, but that practice might contradict when informal education shapes behavior more powerfully than formal training. I am Police Commissioner Angela Washington, and you have just committed assault against your superior officer while demonstrating exactly the kind of behavior that reform must eliminate from law enforcement if we are to serve community rather than oppressing it. Angela continues, her words carrying weight that position provides when authority meets accountability, when power serves justice rather than personal prejudice, when leadership demands standards that individual officers must meet, regardless of personal biases that culture might protect, but that democracy requires eliminating through consequences that behavior earns, when public service becomes public trust that violation should destroy through accountability that corruption resists, but that integrity demands. Brad's shock at revelation creates moment of cognitive dissonance as worldview that depends on assumptions about hierarchy, authority, and social position collides with reality that challenges every prejudice that career has reinforced when informal education taught lessons that formal training contradicted, when cultural bias shaped expectations that official policy rejected, when personal prejudice created blind spots that professional responsibility should eliminate, but that institutional protection often enables through networks that defend misconduct, while punishing accountability that democracy demand from public servants whose legitimacy depends on community consent rather than personal preference about who deserves respect versus who deserves suspicion. The transformation of power dynamics in Diner becomes visible as other officers arrive for shift change, their presence creating audience for demonstration of accountability that institutional culture typically prevents when misconduct gets protected through loyalty that serves corruption rather than justice, when silence enables abuse rather than preventing it, when professional courtesy becomes complicity in violations that honor should reject but that practice might defend through. Comfortable assumptions that reform must challenge if law enforcement is to serve everyone rather than just those whose prejudices align with officer biases that training should eliminate, but that culture often reinforces through informal networks that accountability must penetrate. The Diner becomes impromptu courtroom as Angela exercises authority that position provides when accountability meets resistance, when leadership confronts corruption, when justice demands response that individual officers might resist, but that institutional power must enforce if law enforcement is to serve democracy rather than authoritarianism through methods that constitutional principles require, but that cultural practices often contradict when informal education shapes behavior more powerfully than formal training, when peer pressure reinforces prejudices that policy should eliminate, but that tradition often protects through networks that defend misconduct while punishing integrity. Brad's attempts to justify assault reveal mindset that views citizens as subjects rather than employers, that treats rights as privileges rather than protections, that sees law enforcement as mechanism for maintaining social control rather than ensuring equal justice, when officers forget that democracy requires serving everyone rather than just those whose appearance matches comfort zones that bias creates around assumptions about whose safety matters when authority serves prejudice rather than people through methods that accountability should eliminate, but that institutional culture often protects when loyalty becomes complicity in violations that honor should prevent. 20 years of service, Commissioner, 20 years of keeping these streets safe from people who... Brad begins, his defense revealing exactly the problem that reform must address when officers view communities as enemies rather than employers, when law enforcement becomes occupation rather than service, when badges represent authority rather than accountability, when power corrupts those who forget that uniform creates responsibility rather than privilege, service rather than superiority, protection rather than domination, when democracy functions through principles that training should teach, but that culture often contradicts through informal education that shapes behavior. Angela's response demonstrates leadership that position demands when accountability confronts resistance, when authority serves justice rather than personal preference, when power must be exercised not for revenge, but for reform that systematic change requires if law enforcement is to fulfill constitutional obligations rather than perpetuating systematic oppression through methods that democracy rejects, but that authoritarianism embraces when control becomes goal rather than service, when fear replaces trust as foundation for community relations that effectiveness requires, but that misconduct destroys through actions that reveal character that uniform cannot improve, when prejudice overwhelms professionalism. Officer Mitchell, 20 years of systematic violation of constitutional rights, 20 years of treating citizens as enemies rather than employers, 20 years of demonstrating exactly why reform is necessary if law enforcement is to serve justice rather than perpetuating injustice, Angela responds, her words carrying authority that experience provides when leadership must choose between institutional loyalty and public service, between protecting corruption and demanding accountability, between maintaining comfort zones and challenging systematic problems that individual misconduct represents, but that cultural patterns enable through informal networks that defend bad actors while punishing those who report violations. The other officers present must choose between loyalty to colleague whose behavior violates everything that law enforcement should represent and accountability to institution whose legitimacy depends on serving community rather than protecting corruption, when professional responsibility demands supporting justice rather than defending misconduct. When oaths require choosing constitutional principles over personal relationships. When democracy functions through individuals who prioritize public service over private loyalty, when pressure tests character that uniform should improve, but that culture might corrupt through informal education that contradicts formal training, when institutional protection enables behavior that accountability should prevent. The consequences that follow demonstrate what accountability looks like when leadership chooses justice over loyalty. When institutional power serves community rather than protecting corruption, when democracy functions through individuals who remember that authority derives from consent rather than force, that legitimacy depends on service rather than dominance, that effectiveness requires trust, that respect builds, but that abuse destroys through actions that reveal whether uniforms represent responsibility or privilege, when power meets accountability through encounters that test whether law enforcement serves people or dominates them, when justice demands equality that prejudice resists through violence disguised as legitimate authority. 6 months later, Brad Mitchell faces federal civil rights charges, while Angela Washington's reforms reshape how police departments across the state approach community relations, training, and accountability, when systematic change requires leadership that chooses justice over loyalty, effectiveness over tradition, constitutional principles over cultural practices that informal education reinforces, but that formal policy must eliminate if law enforcement is to serve democracy rather than perpetuating authoritarianism through methods that accountability should govern, but that institutional protection often enables when loyalty becomes complicity in violations that honor should prevent. The diner incident becomes case study in police academies, where new officers learn about constitutional rights, community relations, and professional responsibility that systematic reform has made central to training that previously focused on tactics rather than ethics, enforcement rather than service, control rather than accountability, when law enforcement serves people rather than dominating them through methods that democracy requires, but that culture often contradicts when informal. Education shapes behavior more powerfully than formal instruction that policy establishes, but that practice might undermine through networks that defend misconduct while punishing integrity that democracy demands. Angela's leadership transforms not just policies, but culture that systematic change requires, when reform must penetrate informal networks that protect corruption rather than serving justice. When accountability must overcome institutional loyalty that enables misconduct rather than preventing it. When democracy must function through individuals who choose constitutional principles over personal prejudices that training should eliminate, but that culture often reinforces through comfortable assumptions about whose rights matter, when authority serves some while oppressing others through methods that equality rejects, but that privilege might defend when power corrupts those who forget that service requires accountability. The coffee stain on Angela's clothes has been cleaned, but the impact of that moment continues reshaping law enforcement culture, when leadership demands accountability that individual officers must meet regardless of personal biases that informal networks might protect, but that systematic reform requires eliminating through consequences that behavior earns rather than immunity that position might provide, when badges represent responsibility rather than privilege, service rather than superiority, protection rather than domination, when authority serves people rather than personal prejudice through methods that democracy demands, but that culture often resists when change threatens comfort zones. Brad's fall from grace serves as warning to officers whose prejudices might overwhelm professional responsibilities that oaths require, but that culture sometimes undermines when informal education teaches lessons that formal training contradicts. when institutional loyalty protects misconduct rather than preventing it, when professional courtesy becomes complicity in violations that accountability should expose rather than cover, when democracy functions through transparency that corruption fears, but that justice demands, when law enforcement serve community rather than protecting those whose behavior violates constitutional principles that training should reinforce, but that practice often ignores, when power corrupts integrity. The quiet black woman who absorbed coffee and insults with dignity that uniform should have respected, but that prejudice attacked, has become symbol of transformation that systematic reform requires, when leadership chooses accountability over loyalty, justice over tradition, constitutional principles over cultural practices. That change must eliminate if law enforcement is to serve everyone rather than just those whose prejudices align with officer biases that democracy rejects, but that authoritarianism embraces, when control becomes goal rather than service, when fear replaces trust as foundation for relationships that effectiveness requires, but that misconduct destroys through actions that reveal character that badges cannot improve, when corruption overwhelms integrity that oaths should guarantee, but that culture might undermine, when institutional protection enables behavior that accountability should prevent through consequences that justice demands.